What if the very first meal you eat in the morning is silently training your body to store more fat, crave more sugar, and keep your insulin elevated for the entire day? Most people think breakfast is automatically healthy simply because they eat early in the morning. But the truth is, certain breakfast foods can create a metabolic disaster before your day even begins. When you wake up in the morning, your body is naturally more sensitive to blood sugar fluctuations. Cortisol, your primary stress hormone, is already elevated during the early morning hours. This is completely normal because cortisol helps wake you up and mobilize energy. But when you combine high cortisol with a breakfast loaded with refined carbohydrates, sugar, fruit juice, cereal, toast, pancakes, or flavored coffee drinks, you create the perfect environment for a massive insulin spike. Insulin is the hormone responsible for moving sugar out of the bloodstream and into the cells. But insulin also has another major function that many people overlook. It is the body's primary fat storage hormone. The higher your insulin levels rise, the harder it becomes for your body to burn stored fat for energy. This is where the real problem begins. A typical high-carb breakfast rapidly converts into glucose. Within minutes, blood sugar rises sharply. In response, the pancreas releases a large amount of insulin to control that spike. But because refined carbohydrates digest so quickly, blood sugar often crashes just a few hours later. This creates a cycle of fatigue, cravings, irritability, brain fog, and constant hunger. Many people think they lack willpower when they crave snacks before lunch. In reality, it is often a hormonal problem created by their breakfast. One of the biggest metabolic mistakes is starting the day without enough protein and healthy fat. Protein helps stabilize blood sugar and supports another hormone called glucagon. Glucagon works in opposition to insulin. While insulin stores energy, glucagon helps release stored energy, especially stored body fat. If your breakfast lacks protein, glucagon activity stays low, and your body becomes more dependent on sugar for fuel. This creates metabolic inflexibility, where the body loses its ability to efficiently burn fat. Over time, repeated insulin spikes can also reduce insulin sensitivity. This means your cells stop responding properly to insulin, forcing the pancreas to produce even more of it. Eventually, chronically elevated insulin levels can contribute to weight gain, fatty liver, increased abdominal fat, prediabetes, and metabolic syndrome. One of the organs most affected by this process is the liver. When excess sugar enters the bloodstream every morning, the liver converts much of that excess glucose into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. This can lead to fat accumulation inside the liver itself, even in people who do not consume alcohol. A fatty liver then becomes less efficient at regulating blood sugar and metabolism, worsening the cycle even further. Another hidden issue is the effect on appetite hormones. A high-sugar breakfast can disrupt leptin and ghrelin, the hormones responsible for hunger and fullness. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, tends to rise again quickly after a carb-heavy breakfast, while leptin signaling becomes weaker over time. This is why many people feel hungry again shortly after eating cereal, toast, or oatmeal loaded with sweeteners. In contrast, a breakfast rich in protein, healthy fats, and nutrients creates a completely different hormonal response. Eggs, avocados, unsweetened Greek yogurt, nuts, seeds, and quality proteins slow digestion and stabilize glucose levels. This reduces insulin spikes and provides a steady source of energy to the brain and muscles. Certain nutrients also play a major role in insulin control. Magnesium is especially important because it supports insulin receptor function and glucose metabolism. Low magnesium levels are extremely common and are strongly associated with insulin resistance. Chromium, potassium, and B vitamins also help regulate energy production and blood sugar balance. Even sleep quality can be affected by poor insulin control throughout the day. When blood sugar fluctuates constantly, cortisol and adrenaline may remain elevated longer than normal, interfering with deep restorative sleep. Poor sleep then increases insulin resistance the following day, creating another vicious cycle. This is why breakfast is not just about calories, it is about hormones. The first meal of the day sends powerful signals to your metabolism. It can either activate stable energy production and fat burning, or it can push your body into fat storage and sugar dependence for the rest of the day. The key is understanding that insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone. It is a master metabolic hormone that influences fat storage, hunger, inflammation, energy levels, liver health, and long-term metabolic function. And for many people, the damage starts with the wrong breakfast every single morning. What if your breakfast is missing the one nutrient your metabolism desperately needs to keep blood sugar stable and fat burning active? Most people focus on calories in the morning, but the real issue is hormonal control. And one of the biggest breakfast mistakes is not eating enough protein. A low-protein breakfast can silently disrupt blood sugar, increase cravings, slow metabolism, and keep your body dependent on sugar for energy throughout the entire day. Many common breakfast foods are heavily loaded with carbohydrates but contain very little high-quality protein. Cereal, toast, pancakes, muffins, bagels, and even many smoothies can create a serious imbalance in your metabolic hormones. Protein is not just important for muscles, it directly affects insulin, glucagon, dopamine, appetite hormones, and metabolic stability. When you eat adequate protein in the morning, your body activates several mechanisms that help regulate blood sugar and improve energy production. One of the most important hormones influenced by protein is glucagon. Most people have heard of insulin, but very few understand glucagon. These two hormones work together like a metabolic balancing system. Insulin lowers blood sugar by storing nutrients inside cells, while glucagon helps release stored energy when the body needs fuel. Glucagon supports fat burning by signaling the liver to release stored energy and increase the use of fat for fuel. When breakfast lacks protein, glucagon stimulation stays too low. At the same time, a carbohydrate-heavy breakfast pushes insulin levels much higher. This creates an unhealthy hormonal ratio where insulin dominates and fat burning becomes suppressed. As a result, the body becomes more dependent on glucose and less efficient at using stored fat for energy. This is one reason many people feel hungry again shortly after breakfast. Their body burns through glucose rapidly, but because fat burning was never properly activated, energy levels crash quickly. This often leads to mid-morning cravings for caffeine, sugar, or snacks. Protein also slows gastric emptying, which means food leaves the stomach more slowly. This creates a more gradual release of glucose into the bloodstream and prevents sudden insulin spikes. Stable blood sugar means fewer energy crashes, better focus, and less activation of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Another major factor is the effect protein has on satiety hormones. A protein-deficient breakfast can weaken peptide YY and GLP-1, two important hormones that help signal fullness to the brain. At the same time, ghrelin, the hunger hormone, tends to rise faster when meals are low in protein. This combination makes people feel less satisfied even after eating enough calories. This is why someone can eat a large bowl of cereal and still feel hungry 2 hours later. The brain itself also depends heavily on amino acids from protein. Neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine require amino acids to function properly. Without enough protein early in the day, mental focus, motivation, mood stability, and concentration can all decline. In many cases, people mistake blood sugar instability for fatigue or lack of motivation when the real issue is poor metabolic signaling. Protein intake also affects muscle preservation and metabolic rate. Muscle tissue is metabolically active, meaning it burns energy even at rest. When protein intake is consistently too low, especially at breakfast, the body may struggle to maintain lean muscle mass over time. This becomes even more important with aging. As people get older, muscle protein synthesis naturally declines. A low-protein breakfast can accelerate muscle loss, slow metabolism, and reduce insulin sensitivity. This contributes to weight gain, weakness, and increased fat accumulation around the abdomen. Another overlooked issue is the effect on the liver. When breakfast is dominated by refined carbohydrates without enough protein, the liver receives excess glucose that often gets converted into triglycerides. Over time, this can contribute to fatty liver development and worsening insulin resistance. Protein helps stabilize this process by reducing excessive glucose fluctuations and supporting healthier metabolic function. Certain nutrients commonly found in protein-rich foods are also essential for insulin regulation. Eggs, fish, meat, and dairy products contain important nutrients such as vitamin B12, choline, zinc, iron, and amino acids that support mitochondrial energy production and hormone balance. Choline is especially important because it helps transport fat out of the liver. Without enough choline, fat accumulation inside the liver can increase more rapidly. This is one reason nutrient-dense protein foods play such a critical role in metabolic health. A high-quality breakfast should create hormonal stability, not metabolic chaos. When the body receives enough protein in the morning, insulin becomes more controlled, glucagon activity improves, appetite stabilizes, and the body becomes more efficient at using stored fat for energy. Energy levels stay more consistent, cravings decrease, and metabolic flexibility improves. The goal is not simply to eat breakfast. The goal is to send the right hormonal signals to the body from the very beginning of the day. And protein is one of the most powerful metabolic tools for making that happen. What if the reason you constantly crave sugar, feel exhausted in the afternoon, and struggle with stubborn belly fat is not just your diet, but a hidden hormonal imbalance triggered every single morning? One of the most damaging effects of repeated insulin spikes is the disruption of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. Most people think cortisol is only related to stress and anxiety, but cortisol is actually a powerful metabolic hormone that affects blood sugar, fat storage, appetite, inflammation, sleep, and energy production. When insulin and cortisol become chronically dysregulated together, the body enters a state of metabolic stress that can lead to rapid weight gain and long-term hormonal dysfunction. In the early morning, cortisol naturally rises as part of the body's circadian rhythm. This is called the cortisol awakening response. Its purpose is to help increase alertness, mobilize stored energy, and prepare the body for activity. Under healthy conditions, cortisol rises temporarily and then gradually declines throughout the day. But when someone consumes a breakfast high in sugar and refined carbohydrates, insulin levels spike aggressively on top of already elevated morning cortisol. This creates a major metabolic conflict inside the body. Initially, blood sugar rises rapidly. The pancreas responds by releasing large amounts of insulin to push glucose into the cells. But because these processed carbohydrates digest very quickly, blood sugar often drops too fast afterward. When blood sugar crashes, the body interprets this as a stress signal. In response, the adrenal glands release even more cortisol along with adrenaline to bring blood sugar back up. This is why many people feel shaky, anxious, irritable, fatigued, or intensely hungry just a few hours after breakfast. The body is essentially experiencing a hormonal roller coaster between insulin spikes and stress hormone activation. Over time, this repeated cycle can keep cortisol chronically elevated for much longer than normal. Chronically high cortisol has several dangerous effects on metabolism. One of the most important is its impact on abdominal fat accumulation. Cortisol strongly influences where the body stores fat, especially around the midsection. Fat cells in the abdominal area contain a higher concentration of cortisol receptors, making them especially sensitive to stress hormones. This is one reason chronic stress and blood sugar instability are so strongly linked to stubborn belly fat. Elevated cortisol can also increase appetite by stimulating cravings for high-calorie, high-sugar foods. The brain begins seeking quick sources of glucose because it perceives the body to be under stress. This creates a cycle where people crave more sugar, consume more refined carbohydrates, trigger more insulin spikes, and continue worsening hormonal imbalance. Another major issue is the effect on insulin sensitivity. High cortisol levels can make cells less responsive to insulin, forcing the pancreas to release even more insulin to maintain blood sugar control. This condition, known as insulin resistance, is one of the primary drivers of metabolic syndrome, obesity, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes. The liver is also heavily affected. Under chronic cortisol exposure, the liver increases glucose production through a process called gluconeogenesis. Even when someone is not eating, the liver may continue releasing excess glucose into the bloodstream due to stress hormone signaling. This places additional pressure on insulin regulation and can worsen fasting blood sugar levels over time. At the same time, elevated cortisol can interfere with thyroid hormone conversion. The thyroid gland controls metabolic rate, temperature regulation, and energy production. Chronic stress may reduce the conversion of T4 into active T3, slowing metabolism and contributing to fatigue, weight gain, brain fog, and low energy levels. Sleep quality often declines as well. When cortisol remains elevated late into the evening due to unstable blood sugar patterns throughout the day, deep restorative sleep becomes more difficult. Poor sleep itself raises cortisol further the next day and worsens insulin resistance, creating another metabolic cycle that becomes difficult to break. Nutrient deficiencies can also intensify these problems. Magnesium is especially important because it helps regulate the nervous system, insulin sensitivity, and cortisol balance. Chronic stress and high insulin levels can deplete magnesium more rapidly. Low magnesium levels are associated with muscle tension, fatigue, sleep disturbances, increased cravings, and impaired glucose control. Vitamin C and B vitamins are also heavily utilized by the adrenal glands during prolonged stress hormone production. Over time, nutrient depletion may further weaken metabolic resilience and energy production. One of the most effective ways to reduce this hormonal chaos is stabilizing blood sugar early in the day. A breakfast centered around protein, healthy fats, fiber, and nutrient-dense foods creates a much slower glucose response. This reduces excessive insulin release and lowers the likelihood of cortisol-driven blood sugar crashes later in the morning. Stable blood sugar sends a message of safety to the body. When insulin stays controlled and cortisol follows a healthier rhythm, energy becomes more stable, cravings decrease, inflammation lowers, and fat burning improves more efficiently. The body no longer feels trapped in survival mode. The important thing to understand is that weight gain and fatigue are not always caused by eating too much. In many cases, they are driven by repeated hormonal stress patterns that begin with the very first meal of the day. And one of the biggest hidden triggers is the constant cycle of insulin spikes and cortisol imbalance happening silently inside the body every morning. What if your breakfast is slowly damaging your metabolism without you even realizing it? Many people think insulin spikes are harmless, as long as blood sugar eventually comes back down. But repeated insulin surges, especially every morning, can gradually change how your cells respond to insulin itself. Over time, this process can push the body toward insulin resistance, one of the most dangerous hidden drivers of weight gain, fatigue, inflammation, and metabolic disease. Insulin resistance does not happen overnight. It develops slowly through repeated exposure to elevated insulin levels. Every time you consume a breakfast loaded with refined carbohydrates, sugary drinks, processed grains, or sweetened foods, blood sugar rises rapidly. In response, the pancreas releases insulin to move glucose into the cells. At first, the body handles this process relatively well. But when insulin levels remain elevated day after day, cells begin protecting themselves by becoming less responsive to insulin signals. This is similar to turning down the volume on a signal that is constantly too loud. The body does this as a defense mechanism against excessive glucose exposure. The problem is that the pancreas now has to produce even more insulin to force glucose into the cells. This creates chronic hyperinsulinemia, meaning insulin levels stay abnormally high for long periods of time. Many people develop this condition years before blood sugar becomes elevated enough to show diabetes on routine lab tests. In other words, insulin resistance often exists silently long before a diagnosis is made. One of the earliest signs is increased abdominal fat accumulation. High insulin levels strongly promote fat storage, particularly around the liver and abdominal organs. This type of visceral fat is metabolically active and highly inflammatory. It releases inflammatory compounds that worsen insulin resistance even further. This becomes a vicious cycle. The more insulin resistance develops, the more insulin the pancreas must release. And the more insulin circulates, the harder it becomes for the body to access stored fat for energy. Fat burning becomes suppressed while fat storage becomes amplified. Many people in this state feel constantly hungry despite carrying excess body fat. This happens because their cells are struggling to efficiently use both glucose and fat for fuel. The body remains trapped in a state of unstable energy production. The liver plays a central role in this process. When excess carbohydrates are consumed regularly, especially in the morning when cortisol is already elevated, the liver converts surplus glucose into triglycerides. Over time, fat begins accumulating inside liver cells, leading to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. A fatty liver becomes less responsive to insulin and less efficient at regulating blood sugar. This further worsens fasting glucose levels and insulin resistance. In many cases, fatty liver disease develops before type 2 diabetes fully appears. The pancreas is also placed under tremendous stress. The beta cells inside the pancreas are responsible for producing insulin. Constantly forcing these cells to overwork can eventually impair their function. Over time, insulin production may become dysregulated, leading to worsening blood sugar control and increased risk for diabetes progression. Another major consequence involves the mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy-producing structures inside cells. Chronic exposure to high insulin and high glucose can damage mitochondrial efficiency, reducing the body's ability to generate stable energy. This often leads to fatigue, brain fog, exercise intolerance, and slower metabolism. Inflammation also rises significantly during insulin resistance. Elevated insulin can stimulate inflammatory pathways throughout the body, increasing oxidative stress and damaging blood vessels. This contributes to higher risks for cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and metabolic syndrome. Hormones beyond insulin become affected as well. In women, insulin resistance can increase androgen production, contributing to symptoms like acne, irregular cycles, and increased abdominal fat. In men, chronic metabolic dysfunction may contribute to lower testosterone levels, reduced muscle mass, and decreased energy production. Sleep quality often declines too. High insulin and unstable blood sugar can disrupt melatonin and cortisol rhythms, leading to nighttime awakenings and poor recovery during sleep. Poor sleep then increases insulin resistance even further the following day. Nutrient deficiencies can accelerate this process. Magnesium deficiency is extremely common in people with insulin resistance because magnesium is required for insulin receptor activity and glucose transport. Low magnesium levels can worsen fatigue, muscle weakness, cravings, and blood sugar instability. Chromium deficiency may also impair glucose metabolism by reducing insulin sensitivity. Vitamin D plays a critical role as well because it supports pancreatic function, immune regulation, and insulin signaling. One of the most powerful ways to protect insulin sensitivity is controlling the first major insulin response of the day. A breakfast built around protein, healthy fats, fiber, and nutrient-dense foods creates a much smaller glucose rise and requires far less insulin. This allows cells to remain more sensitive to insulin over time and helps the body maintain metabolic flexibility. The goal is not simply lowering calories. The goal is reducing chronic hormonal overload. When insulin remains controlled, the body becomes more efficient at burning fat, stabilizing energy, protecting the liver, and maintaining healthy cellular function. But when insulin spikes happen repeatedly every morning, the body slowly shifts toward resistance, inflammation, and metabolic dysfunction. And for many people, the process begins long before they ever realize something is wrong. What if the constant hunger, stubborn cravings, and uncontrollable snacking you experience throughout the day are not caused by lack of discipline, but by a nutrient-deficient breakfast disrupting your hunger hormones from the very beginning of the morning? One of the most overlooked causes of unstable appetite and metabolic dysfunction is eating a breakfast that lacks healthy fats, minerals, and essential nutrients needed for proper hormonal balance. Most processed breakfast foods are designed to deliver quick energy, but they fail to provide the nutrients required to regulate insulin, appetite, and cellular energy production. Foods like cereal, pastries, flavored yogurt, toast, waffles, and sweetened oatmeal may temporarily fill the stomach, but they often leave the body metabolically unsatisfied. The reason comes down to hormones and nutrient signaling. Your brain constantly monitors nutrient intake to determine whether the body is truly nourished. When meals lack healthy fats, protein, magnesium, potassium, and other essential nutrients, the brain may continue driving hunger signals even after calories have been consumed. This is why many people feel hungry shortly after breakfast despite eating enough food. One of the most important hormones involved in this process is ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone. Ghrelin is produced primarily in the stomach and signals the brain when the body needs energy. Normally, a nutrient-dense meal helps suppress ghrelin for several hours. But when breakfast is dominated by refined carbohydrates without enough healthy fats or minerals, ghrelin tends to rise again quickly. Blood sugar spikes and crashes rapidly, creating repeated hunger signals throughout the day. At the same time, another hormone called leptin becomes disrupted. Leptin is produced by fat cells and helps tell the brain when the body has enough stored energy. Chronic insulin spikes and nutrient-poor diets can contribute to leptin resistance, a condition where the brain stops responding properly to fullness signals. As a result, people may continue craving food even when they have excess body fat stored. This creates a dangerous metabolic mismatch where the body stores more fat while simultaneously increasing hunger. Healthy fats are especially important because they slow digestion and stabilize blood sugar. Fats also help stimulate satiety hormones like cholecystokinin, which signals fullness and helps regulate appetite control. Without enough dietary fat, meals digest too quickly and fail to create long-lasting metabolic satisfaction. Another critical issue involves the brain itself. The brain is made largely of fat and relies heavily on healthy fatty acids for proper neurotransmitter function and cellular communication. Omega-3 fatty acids, cholesterol, and fat-soluble vitamins all play important roles in hormone production and nervous system health. When breakfast lacks healthy fats, cognitive function and energy stability can suffer. Many people experience brain fog, poor concentration, irritability, and mental fatigue without realizing the issue may be related to unstable blood sugar and nutrient deficiency. Minerals also play a major role in appetite regulation and insulin control. Magnesium is one of the most important nutrients involved in glucose metabolism and insulin receptor sensitivity. It helps regulate over 300 biochemical reactions in the body, including nerve function, muscle relaxation, energy production, and blood sugar balance. Low magnesium levels are strongly associated with insulin resistance, fatigue, muscle cramps, headaches, anxiety, and sugar cravings. Unfortunately, magnesium deficiency is extremely common, especially in people consuming processed foods. Potassium deficiency can also contribute to fatigue and poor metabolic function. Potassium supports adrenal balance, muscle function, and cellular hydration. Without adequate potassium, energy production becomes less efficient and cortisol regulation may become impaired. B vitamins are another major factor. These vitamins are essential for mitochondrial energy production, nervous system function, and carbohydrate metabolism. A breakfast lacking nutrient density can leave the body struggling to efficiently convert food into usable energy. This often results in fatigue, increased hunger, and greater dependence on caffeine and sugar later in the day. The liver is also affected by nutrient-poor eating patterns. When meals are low in nutrients but high in sugar and refined carbohydrates, the liver becomes overloaded with excess glucose while lacking the nutritional support needed for proper detoxification and fat metabolism. Over time, this can contribute to fatty liver development and worsening insulin resistance. One of the most powerful strategies for controlling appetite is creating metabolic stability early in the morning. A breakfast that includes healthy fats, quality protein, fiber, and mineral-rich foods creates a much slower release of glucose into the bloodstream. This keeps insulin more stable, reduces ghrelin fluctuations, improves leptin signaling, and helps the body access stored fat for energy more efficiently. Foods like eggs, avocados, nuts, seeds, olive oil, unsweetened yogurt, and nutrient-dense proteins provide the body with both energy and hormonal support. Instead of creating short-term fullness followed by cravings, these foods promote longer-lasting satiety and metabolic balance. The important thing to understand is that hunger is not controlled by calories alone. It is controlled by hormones, nutrient status, blood sugar stability, and the brain's perception of nourishment. When breakfast lacks the nutrients required for these systems to function properly, the body continues searching for energy and satisfaction all day long. And for many people, that cycle of cravings, fatigue, and overeating begins with a nutrient-deficient breakfast every single morning.